Well, Alessandra, welcome to the podcast. I am absolutely thrilled about the conversation we're about to have.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm also really excited about it.
Yeah. Okay. So you are an author. You describe yourself as a Black Catholic. So there's just so much content that I'm excited to get into with you. And let's just start kind of at the beginning and basic. So, how did you get into writing?
So, I actually got into writing back in 2007. For people who are, well, African American people who are in the Bay Area, they might be familiar with a magazine called City Flight. It was kind of like the local regional African American magazine that had like all kinds of news about what was going on in the Black community. And it first was in print and then it went to completely online. So I worked as a contributing writer for City Flight for I think it was about a year. Actually, no, it was a little bit longer than a year, for about 3 years. And that just kind of got my feet wet with writing, working with an editor, working with the team. And it wasn't until about 2012 that I really started writing fiction. And I just felt like there was stories that I wanted to tell that couldn't necessarily be told through nonfiction, through essays. Just kind of delve deeper into like humanity, into stories that touch people in a different way than nonfiction can. So I signed my contract for my first book in 2015, and that was published in 2016, Blaming the Wind. And then my next book was published in 2018, Everything She Lost. And my third book is under contract right now.
Wow. Okay. So you covered a lot of ground right there, and I want to unpack it a little bit more. And so I'm going to just press rewind all the way back to the beginning. Were you the kind of kid who would wake up in the morning and you're just like, I am going to be a writer? Did you live in a house that encouraged that? How did you go from kind of the prototypical parental urge to kind of do something useful with your life to deciding that like, actually that's something useful is writing that I can do? How did you make that connection?
I think that's a really good point because my grandfather was actually a poet and a writer. He taught
Hmm.
African literature.
Wow.
He was the longest tenured at University of Pittsburgh, and he's originally from South Africa. But when I was writing, I had his books that he had written, and I was
Very
really
cool.
close to him as an adult. And I think the fact that I knew someone who was published made it feel like that's a possibility. Because as anyone who's told you about trying to get a novel published or any type of book published, it's actually a really hard process. And it can feel really discouraging, and you get a lot of rejection. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of times when you want to give up. I mean, at least that was my experience. So I think just knowing in my mind that I could be published made me
Hmm.
keep persevering.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and in fact, that was the next thing I was going to ask you to unpack because you mentioned that you started writing nonfiction around 2012, and then you jumped right ahead to your first novel being published in 2015. That's a lot of time in there. And yeah, like you said, everything I've heard is that it's just brutal to kind of actually get yourself in contract. I've heard it described in so many different ways. So I just love to hear you kind of describe what that process was like. Again, I love that perspective that you had that anchor point in the future that said, this is possible. This is part, I can see my reflection in this reality,
Mhm.
but that doesn't necessarily make the path easier to walk. It just makes it knowable. So what was that like for you? How did you overcome some of those more discouraging obstacles that came up?
Well, I think also when I was writing nonfiction in 2007, it was completely different than fiction. So
Mhm.
when I started becoming serious about wanting to write a novel, I took a bunch of online courses about writing, and then I transitioned to at our local community center a writing critique group.
Mm.
Actually, the very first class I took was an intro to writing fiction, and then from there was different writing critique groups. Sorry about that. So there was a lot of learning. It's not like I just woke up and said, I want to write a novel. There was like a lot that went into that on my end to understand how to write a novel and to
Mm,
really work on the craft. So when my book was finally ready in 2014, I started querying agents because, as a lot of people know, if you want to go with like a big five publisher, or I think it's going to be big four now.
yeah,
Um,
that's right.
yeah, so if you want to go with one of those publishers, you need to get an agent. So I literally queried all the agents that represented women's fiction, and I
Hmm.
got a no from all of them.
Oh no. Okay.
Yeah. So I actually had shelved, that's what they call it when you kind of say, okay, I'm going to put this aside. I
Hmm.
had shelved my novel, and I don't know if you've ever heard of NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, where
Okay.
people from all over the world try to write a novel in 30 days.
Oh, wow. Actually, that might have been the way that I first heard of you on some
Okay.
Instagram post about it, maybe like in 2018 or 2019. Would that have been a thing?
Well, I think it was 2014 that it was November, and I said, okay, you know what? I'm gonna put that aside and I'm gonna try to do NaNoWriMo because I had
Mm,
friends who had done it before.
yeah.
So I actually wrote, and when they say write a novel, it's like reach a goal of 50,000 words.
Okay.
But a real like usually a published novel is between like 80 to 120,000 words. But for the purposes of NaNoWriMo, it's 50,000 words.
Yeah.
So I actually did that. And that ended up becoming my second book.
Oh,
But
cool. Okay.
yeah, but I had this blog post called How Taco Bell Got Me a Book Deal.
Hmm.
And what ended up happening was in 2015, I had gone to Taco Bell and got a Taco Bell sauce packet, and it said, "Why not?" And the title of Blaming the Wind while I was querying it was Why Not? But it was
Hmm.
KNOT, kind of
Okay.
like referring to marriage.
Yeah.
So I said, you know what? I really put a lot of time and effort into that book. And I really love the characters. And I think I'm going to try one more time to see if I can get it published.
Hmm.
So instead of going for more agents, because I had kind of exhausted that, I submitted to three different small publishers. I had done my research and saw some small publishers that I thought looked like legit and like I wanted to work with them. And then from that, I ended up getting a publishing offer from Reddit Publishing, which is the publisher that I went with. Yeah.
Well, and I'm definitely not a writer. Well, actually, let me be more clear. I like to think that I could be a writer, but when I look at real writers, I'm like, holy smokes, I'm just like, I don't have the skill for it. But I love hearing kind of that process because I'm an Enneagram type 3, which typically means that I love being the best at whatever I try. And if I can't be the best on the first try, I just give up on it.
Mhm.
And so I've heard people talk about the writing process. Recently, I was watching a YouTube video about it, and this guy described it as his FBR process: fast, bad, and wrong, which obviously R isn't wrong. And that's
Yeah.
kind of one of the points to it. But he would just write it and knowing that he was doing it wrong, but just
Mhm.
to get it out.
Mhm.
And then there's also other interviews I've heard with authors who say, no, I write one version and that's what I turn in. That's just what it is. And I'm like, that's
Mhm.
mind blowing. But I have a tension with both because I understand the necessity of kind of like do it wrong the first time.
Mhm.
But then I feel that internal tension of like, but it has to be perfect
Mhm.
because that's like my personality. So, how do you personally navigate some of those tensions?
So, especially if you go with a publisher or if you go with an agent, you're going to have to do a lot of editing and revision. So, you're like with both of my novels, I turned them into my publisher. And even with my second one, my publisher wanted some revisions before it got to the editor.
Mm,
So, and I'm like, um, even though Reddit Up Publishing is a small press, they are really known for how well edited the books are and just kind of like the quality of the books because
mm,
they really put a lot of time and effort into them. So with our publishing company, it can take from about 6 weeks to even 6 months to
hmm.
work with an editor.
Wow.
So yeah, so I mean, for me, it's kind of part of the process where it's like I know that this isn't the best it can be. And
Hmm.
I'm so grateful that I've had a great editor who really helps me get it to the place where it is like as good as it's going to get.
Hmm. Okay. Have there ever been a moment or a story where like there's one scene you particularly love, or there's one character who you're just like head over heels with, and then your editor comes along and asks for changes that like cut to the heart of what you love about those things?
Um, I don't think that that's happened in
Okay.
particular. Yeah, I think that I'm lucky that the editor that I've worked with, we have a really similar vision
Hmm.
for the characters and for the book. But I mean, I have heard of people walking away from publishing contracts or
Hmm.
leaving an agent because they just couldn't see eye to eye.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So then
So
they
that
chose their
happens.
creative freedom over kind of
Yeah.
the option of being published.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Definitely.
That's a hard tension.
Oh
Because
yeah,
if you walk away
definitely.
from that, are you going to get another try somewhere else? Who knows? There's no promise
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen it both ways where people have gone on to get an even bigger, like, book deal or,
Hmm.
but I think there's definitely that chance if you walk away, you might not get the opportunity again.
One of the reasons I was most excited to have this conversation with you is really because of your third novel, which, from the little bit you've told me, it has to do with incarceration and faith and some other things. So, can you, as much as you want to or able to, or your publisher will let you, can you kind of frame out your third novel for us? And then, and because what I would love to get into is this intersection between what it means to live a life of faith in a reality of mass incarceration and how that has birthed this novel for you.
Sure. So my third novel is tentatively titled Last Place Seen. And for some people who are looking at the novel, it's about a couple who, well, there's a 10-year-old girl who goes missing. She's kidnapped.
Mm,
And then there's a young couple that gets drawn into this kidnapping. And
mm,
like you mentioned, the husband has recently come home from being in prison, and him and his wife are trying to kind of pull their lives back together
mm,
after his time away, and they have a toddler. I think who's not even 2 years old yet. So it's like they're trying to parent and they're trying to have a marriage and they're trying to pay the bills and all of the challenges they face. And then the husband becomes a suspect in the kidnapping of a 10-year-old girl.
mm.
So with my novels, I like to talk about serious issues, but I don't like it to be like a lecture or
Mm,
that that's the main part of the story. So like I just said, it's kind of a thriller and there's this mystery component too. It's like a page turner, but I really like to explore, and it's told from both the wife and the husband's point of view.
okay.
So
Yeah.
it's exploring like what is life like for someone who is trying to re-enter society after being in prison.
Mm,
And I don't want to give away too much of it, but it also looks at things like how does your family history, how does how you were grown up, the family that you were born into affect situations that can lead you to being incarcerated.
yeah, man, that's so important to think about. So, was there a when was that moment for you when you kind of woke up and you're like, I need to write about incarceration and reintegration into society? Was that like a conscious moment, or was that has that just always been simmering for a long time? How did that come to be?
I don't think it was really a conscious moment where I thought about that. I think that when you're talking with African Americans, I think most of us know someone who has either been in prison or is imprisoned. It's just
Mm,
one of those things in life where mass incarceration affects the African American community
mm,
much more than it does, let's say, the white community.
yeah.
So it it was just something where I felt like I wanted to explore the issue more.
Mm,
And also, so in 2016, I had a job for a nonprofit called A Better Way.
okay.
And one of the, um, where I worked, there was also people I worked with who were formerly incarcerated. who now worked as like parent support and parent advocates for other people who also were incarcerated and trying to like reunite with their families.
Hmm.
So when I wrote this, I ended up talking with someone who I had worked with who had been incarcerated for a while, and
Hmm.
he was incarcerated at San Quentin.
Oh,
And
wow.
I just kind of wanted to get really that human perspective on
Hmm.
what life was like behind bars and the type of obstacles that he faced when he came home.
Hmm.
And so, um, it was really helpful for me because I've never been incarcerated,
Hmm.
but to just talk to someone, and because there's so many stereotypes
Yeah.
about people who've been incarcerated.
Hmm.
And I've noticed even with my social media, when I talk about like racism, I'll get like usually a really like encouraging and overwhelming response. People who are like, yeah, like, racism is bad, and talking about anti-racism. But when you talk about mass incarceration, or when you talk about helping people who were formerly incarcerated, you get a lot of silence and
Hmm.
there's a lot of discomfort. And
Hmm.
I think that that's one thing we're gonna talk about more, but I felt like if I was writing in a way that humanizes people who
Yeah.
have been in prison before,
Right.
that I think that that will give people kind of a different context.
Yeah. That is so important because, because it's almost tragic that you have to say it that way because of course they're human, right?
Mhm,
So
mhm,
it's tragic in its own way that they need humanizing,
mhm,
but also it's so good that you're doing it, because yeah, it's interesting. So obviously I'm a middle-aged white male, and so if you were to draw a map of intersectionality, I kind of stack up at the intersection of all of privilege, and it's something I talk a lot about in season one. But I'm the son of a landowner. I'm white. I'm male. I'm college educated. I'm cisgendered, straight. I'm come from a Judeo-Christian background. I mean, you could just take every single layer, and I sit on the tip of Everest of white privilege. And so my own journey into seeing my whiteness and being able to have non-defensive conversations about racism have been going on for a number of years, starting in college, really through InterVarsity, which I'm thankful for, and has been continuing. But a big trigger for me was actually this conversation about mass incarceration. That was kind of what pushed me over the edge from like, okay, this is just a social conversation that some people want to have, to like, the conversation about how white people have created systems of imbalance and preference is like a true evil. And to me, my eyes were first opened through realizing the disparity of who's incarcerated and what for. And oh my goodness. And then in 2016, reading Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy and just like, oh man. So this is like, for me, and it is interesting because I also resonate with what you're saying, that now I meet weekly with a group of other white people, and we're trying to do some internal work on anti-racism. And there have been a few times, like, well, I'll just give one example. It was last summer during the California wildfires, and we had the conversation about like the question was asked, how are we currently benefiting from systemic racism? And there was some silence. And I said, well, guys, right now, we are literally benefiting from systemic racism because there are inmates who are getting paid $1 a day, slave wages,
mhm,
to go put out fires to protect our property. I mean, that we have literally recreated a slaveholder system
mhm,
wherein human bodies are subjugated to torment to protect white people's land.
mhm,
And so this is where I'm sitting with mass incarceration. Um, but I'm also sitting at the kind of not only apex of privilege, but also that distance of whiteness, where,
mhm,
like you said, I'm farther from incarceration.
mhm.
So I just want to unpack that a little bit more with you, and kind of some things that you've been thinking about it, and other. I'll just be quiet and leave it open like that and see where you go with it.
Well, I did want to ask you when you had mentioned that to your group, what was the response?
Discomfort,
Mhm.
kind of that squeaking of the chairs
Mhm.
of like a, oh dear God. Um, and the discomfort I think was paired with a sense of like, now that we know it, are we obligated to do something about it?
Mhm.
And if we are obligated to do something, is there something we can do that's shy of the ultra dramatic, I'm going to walk out with a fire hose? Well, first, I'm going to give away my land to a person of color. And then two, I'm going to take up the front lines on the fire line, right? Like, so that's like the ultimate dramatic reversal of
Mhm.
roles. So is there something between here and there that we can do?
Yeah.
And if so, what is that? And
Yeah.
it's hard.
Well, it's interesting because I was watching, I think it was on CBS, a CBS news piece where they were talking about the history of like redlining
Mm,
and segregation in housing, and how, because of different governmental policies, white people have been able to own homes and then been able to increase their wealth because of that, where that was pretty much shut out for Black people.
yeah.
And at the end, when they were talking about what can be done, the two white men who were kind of historians and who were talking about the history of this, they kind of fell silent. And it
Hmm.
was uncomfortable because it was like, okay, we know this information, but then what do we do with it?
Hmm.
Because it's like people learn information, and a lot of times they don't want to give up any of the privilege that they might have in order
Hmm.
to level the playing field for people of color.
Yeah.
So, but I recently read Rethinking Incarceration, and one of the things that really stuck out to me was a, a 1995 survey had asked, would you close your eyes for a second, envision a drug user, and describe that person to me?
Hmm.
And 95% of respondents pictured a Black person.
Wow.
And the book went on to say that studies have shown that white people are more likely to use and deal drugs, and white youth are 7 times more likely to use cocaine and heroin than
Mm.
Black youth, and 3 times more likely to sell drugs. And at that time of the question was asked, about 15% of drug users were Black. And that's still roughly the same when the book Rethinking Incarceration was published in 2018.
Mm.
But despite these facts, Black people represent the vast majority of drug offenders sent to prison.
Hmm.
And the book later describes how the war on drugs specifically targeted the African American communities, and that until 2010, a 5 year mandatory minimum sentence was triggered for the sale of 500 grams of cocaine,
Mm.
which is typically associated with white users.
Mm.
And in contrast, a 5 year mandatory minimum sentence was triggered for the sale of 5 grams
Mm.
of crack cocaine, which is typically associated with Black or Hispanic users. So, under this unequal and unjust system, Black people served virtually the same amount of time for in prison for nonviolent drug offenses as white people did for violent offenses.
Wow.
And I think if you look now at the opioid crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and I was just reading how there's a settlement that's being proposed between four big pharmaceutical companies, including Johnson and Johnson, for
Mm.
like $26 billion.
Mm.
But when you look at how the opioid crisis has just devastated American
Yeah.
communities, and when you look at how a lot of these drug execs and drug companies knew how dangerous opiates were and
Mm-hmm.
pushed the selling of them
Mm-hmm.
onto like doctors, and a lot of times doctors who were illegally giving prescriptions, all of that.
Mm.
But when you look at the fact that none of those execs are actually facing any type of jail or prison
Gosh.
time for that, and how when you're Black, you're sentenced to time in prison, but when you're white, you can just pay a fine.
Mm.
It's like, when you think about things like that, it blows your mind.
It really and in the most appalling and uncomfortable ways,
Mhm.
because that's real. Like, that is real. Like, we
Mhm.
can't we can't really argue about that. And what's so interesting is, I mean, just last week I was in a conversation with someone who hasn't really even begun kind of an awareness of their own whiteness,
Mhm.
let alone any kind of anti-racist work. And we were talking about homelessness, and again, drugs came up,
Mhm.
right? That was like the de facto bad guy in the room. The boogeyman was drugs. And that's true of like racial disparities and incarceration. That's true of our view of homelessness and other things. And yet, like you just mentioned, drugs really aren't the issue.
Mhm.
Like, apparently we have no problem if billionaires hand out drugs to millions of people.
Exactly.
But if there's a black man on the street, which, and again, I haven't done crack cocaine, I'm not sure, but I think 5 grams is about like a dose for a person, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Is not mass distributed.
Mhm.
So one person has one dose and they'll go to jail for 5 years. You get 500 grams, right? Half a kilogram of pure cocaine. That's a lot of cocaine. That'll rave a party all night long. But a white person has it, well, then they go to jail for the same. So 1/100th of the offense, and a personal offense versus a corporate offense, meaning a group of people at a rave party. And then you just turn that dial all the way up to 11, and you got these pharmaceuticals who are literally manufacturing stuff that is killing millions of people, and we know it.
Mhm.
And it's taken an immense amount of activism in order to even bring that period to some account. And like you just said, their version of accountability is not accountability. There's really no culpability involved in what's happening with the pharmaceuticals, other than just like, well, I guess you're not going to be able to keep making billions of dollars. You're back to making millions of dollars. Sorry.
And I think it's really important what you're talking about because for those Black people who were in prison because of drug offenses or because of selling drugs, their lives are forever changed. Not only
Mm,
because they spent a certain amount of time removed from their family, removed from society, but when they try to get out, they're
mm,
going to have a harder time getting a job because they have a criminal conviction. It's going to be harder to get housing, to, make money, all
yeah.
those type of things. Whereas you look at someone like Johnson and Johnson, a company like Johnson and Johnson, in spite of the opiate scandal, they're
Mhm.
now having, just able to market a drug and all of a sudden they're heroes again.
Yeah, yeah, they really are, right? If you read the headlines right now, they're heroes because of,
Exactly.
their new vaccine that was just approved. And
So I think that that just kind of like emphasizes the disparity in our country. And when you look also at the opioid crisis and how now it's like people who have an opiate addiction are somehow victims and they need treatment and we need to put money towards the community. I absolutely agree with that. But where was that same amount of sympathy and empathy when it was Black and brown people who were the ones who were addicted to drugs?
and we don't even have to go back to the 80s. We can go back to summer 2020 when people were calling to defund the police and redirect funds to community activism and other things, and there was still outrage for that, right? And
Yeah.
then, but when you look at the opioid crisis, which again is primarily a rural white crisis, although it affects all Americans, um, yeah, suddenly everyone was very empathetic to the community support for it. But still, there's this ongoing battle of like, how are police meant to be the first responders for a lot of these issues that they've become first responders to,
Mhm.
and is that even the appropriate channel? And again, yeah, you look at what color body is being responded to, and it's a tragic disparity in a structural policy response.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that was really surprising to me, I've known about mass incarceration since college, and it's something that I've continued to follow. But the in the book it lays out how private prisons actually have quotas for
Mm,
how many prisoners have to
mm.
occupy beds. So this can range from about 70% to 100%
Oh my word.
occupancy. So not only when we're talking about this type of disparity, we're talking about prisons that are profiting off of how many people are imprisoned. And
Yeah.
you have, when you look at that, and when you look in a capitalistic society about companies making money, then of course you're going to have policies that are going to be enacted so more people go to prison
Yeah.
and they're able to make more money off of the number of people who are in prison.
Mm. And let's just draw, just for our listeners, let's just draw a little bit clear of a line in what you're saying there, and correct me if I'm getting it wrong. The way that I understand it, those contracts are written so that the local police departments or the state's justice department, I'm not quite sure which entity it is, has to pay those prisons if they fall below those bed rates.
Yes.
So the local sheriff, the local PD is now incentivized because the attorney general or some budget officer will say, if you don't fill 20 beds this week, we're going to have to write a check for $10,000.
Yes.
Go fill those beds. Well, now the police are financially incentivized, not on the behalf of the citizenry, but on behalf of the private prison to actually meet the quote unquote production demand of the private corporation at the literal direct expense of the citizenry.
Yes.
Oh, man.
And that's not to mention how private companies are also using the prison labor to make goods. And like you had mentioned with the California wildfires, where you're able to pay $1 a day for a firefighter, an inmate firefighter. And with a lot of these companies, people are working in prison and then they're barely getting paid, if it's even $1 a day. And then those companies are then selling whatever is made or whatever service the prisoners are offering for the
Mm.
regular market rate.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Yeah. I
And
mean,
this isn't new. I just like to say this isn't new because
yeah.
I've been listening to the audiobook of W.E.B. Du Bois's The
Mm,
Souls of Black Folks.
mm.
And that was written in 1903. And
Wow.
he's talking about how after slavery, when people could no longer have free slave labor, that there started to be things like black codes where
Yeah.
basically black people were picked up off the street if they didn't have a job or if they said that they had did some type of offense, and then they were working in these different type of jail gangs. I forget exactly what they called them, but they basically were imprisoned and then doing the same type of work that they were forced to do as slaves.
Mm.
Except this time during slavery, the slave owner would have a financial interest in the well being of the slave because
Right.
they wanted to make sure that they were producing whatever product it was. But with the in the convict leasing system, the black people would be worked even harder
Mm.
than slaves were worked because if they ended up dying, which a lot of them did because they were malnourished or overworked, then they would just find someone else to
Ugh.
imprison and then just have them do the work instead.
Oh my gosh.
So this has been going on since after slavery,
Yeah, man.
where black people were have been indispensable in mass incarceration to
Mm.
use their skills and services to benefit from them.
Man, the evil just stacks upon itself. And my personal view of mass incarceration as it stands right now, like you were saying earlier, when inmates are released, especially if you have a felony on your record, it's like it's the new 3/5 law
Mhm,
because you're now no longer fully human.
mhm,
And every single person I've had a conversation with, every single white, but let me be clear, every single white person I've had a conversation with about this will begin squirming. It doesn't matter how progressive or conservative they are. When we begin a conversation about humanizing felons,
mhm,
particularly,
mhm,
suddenly there's a lot of hemming and hawing,
mhm,
right? And it just reveals that systemically, we have created a way to maintain a subhuman class
mhm.
that directly benefits us financially.
Yeah.
and directly benefits our property and shores up our future generations for increased wealth.
Hmm.
It, oh man, it is, it's probably the system in America that I hate the most. And I really don't say that word often, but genuinely, like the way that people go into prison, which I do want to talk about the school to prison pipeline a little bit, but the way that people go into prisons and then the way that we treat them when they come out of prisons is, let alone the way that they're treated in prison, right? Because
Hmm.
all three of those things are just really messed up systems. But even, oh man, if we could, it it just turns me on the inside. And at the same time, like we were saying, what do I do about it? What it's hard to do anything more than just like get angry.
Hmm.
And yet something more is absolutely required.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I appreciated about Rethinking Incarceration, the book, was that it did look at mass incarceration from a biblical standpoint and
Mm,
from a Christian standpoint. And he, Du Bois Gilliard, talked about how Christian thinkers had moved away from the concept of justice in the face of crime as needing repentance and restitution, and instead focusing on the retribution
mm,
aspect. And it was like, instead of like a communal restoration for both the victim and the perpetrator, it moved to the state being
mm,
responsible for punishing the person who committed the crime. So we see this in the everyday American and even Christians view, like you said, when people are squirming of a person who's been incarcerated, we think, well, they did something wrong, so they deserve the
mm,
punishment. And we need to remove them from society. And when they come out, I don't want them working at my job. I
mm,
don't want them at my PTA. I don't want them around my kids. But when you look at the, for example, with the war on drugs, and when you look at the how a lot of people who ended up serving time behind bars weren't even guilty of what
mhm.
happened.
Yeah.
And when you look at um, I mean, if you want to say that we as Christians need to work on the restoration aspect, then it's like, what can we do so that people who were in prison or who were in jail are getting the rehabilitation that they need, either
Mhm,
while they're there or while they come out?
mhm.
What how can they get the rehabilitation? How can they get the mental health treatment? How can they get the substance abuse treatment so that they can really rejoin society?
Yeah. Yeah. And and to me the answer seems both obvious and almost impossible. And it's being human again,
Mhm.
moving away from the three-fifths law back to them being a fully vested human. And that starts, in school, right? That starts when they're younger, but
Mhm.
that carries through all, and of course it starts both individually and politically.
Mhm.
And it has to really start from both directions. But I almost question if there's any individual will, and I don't question whether or not there's political will, because there's not. But I question whether or not there's individual will, even within the Christian church, to have that conversation. Because not only are we then having to question some really deep-seated racist elements within us, us being the white church particularly, but it also brings into question some of our theological views,
Mhm.
because there really is a theological framework which tees up racial incarceration, which is what we now call mass incarceration. Um, there, like you were talking about, that um, penance based, punishment based, right? When you say that the law, that committing a crime is committing a sin, when you equate the written law of the land with the declared righteous activity of God, and you say those two things are not separate anymore, they're now the same. So now if you break the law of the land, you are committing a sin against God. When you make that equation equal, and the American church certainly has, then it becomes then as soon as you begin to question the law of the land, you're now questioning the law of God. You're now questioning theology. You're questioning things that are really deeply held. So I'm not even sure that people want to have that conversation, because even if people want to say, can we make racism go away? They still want to keep all their beliefs comfy cozy inside about God. They think that, well, since Jesus wasn't racist, if we get rid of racism, we won't have to change anything we believe about Jesus. But I believe that that's not true, because I believe that a lot of the ways that the modern, particularly, let's talk about the Protestant evangelical church, the white evangelical church in America, the things that they believe about Jesus tee up racism to exist. And the penal substitution atonement theory is a great cornerstone of the evangelical church, and, like you were just saying, a great example of how it gives space to racist behavior and systemic racism.
I can't speak a lot about white evangelical, um, culture or tradition, but like you mentioned, I am a Black Catholic, and I know that one of the issues that Catholics have really been grappling with is the portrayal of Jesus. And it's
Mm.
like historically, Jesus was from the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
he was from Bethlehem of Judea, which is current day Palestine.
Yeah.
He was not a white guy with blue eyes. I'm sorry to break
You
it
mean
to
he
you.
didn't look like me?
No, I'm sorry. He did not look like you, and it's
Thank
like,
God for that. Yeah.
there's this picture that was making the rounds on Twitter, and it was when a Black person was trying to enter the priesthood, I believe.
Hmm.
And in the Catholic Church, there was a lot of racism, and they did not want to have Black people as priests or as nuns. And there
Hmm.
was this picture that was making the rounds where there was a white woman holding up a sign that said, the 12 apostles were white.
Oh no.
And I was like, okay, but they weren't white.
But they weren't.
I'm sorry to tell you, they weren't
Yeah.
white. And
Yeah.
it's like Jesus wasn't white. And it's
Mm.
like Jesus lived under a brutal Roman occupation.
Mm.
He was an ethnic person of color who was
Mhm.
persecuted and sentenced to death and murdered by the state.
Mhm.
He
Yeah.
was a marginalized person.
Yeah.
So it's like when we look at Jesus within that lens, and it's like, look at what he did to the woman who was accused of adultery when they wanted to stone her.
Yeah.
Like, based on our penal system, he
Mhm.
would have said, yes, stone her, kill her.
Yeah.
But that's not what Jesus said. And
Right.
I'm not saying, like, part of restorative justice is to look at a crime and to restore all the parties, including the victim. And
Yeah.
it's like never to diminish that a crime happened.
Right.
And a lot of Black people who are in jail are for nonviolent offenses. So there
Mhm.
isn't even, we're not talking necessarily about something really severe like rape or murder or anything like that. But it's like, even in every occasion, restorative justice is looking at a crime that occurred and looking at the victim and looking at the person who committed the crime and trying to restore a right relationship with all the people.
Mhm.
And I think when you talk about a right relationship, it's also trying to get to the person who committed the crime what was not right in that person's life that led them
Mhm.
to the point where they felt like they had to commit that crime. And how do you even restore that person to a place where they don't feel like they have to commit a crime? And
Yeah.
when you think about that, that's one of the reasons why people say that a lot of times being poor in itself is considered a crime.
Mm.
Because it's like when you were talking earlier about the school to prison pipeline, a lot of these schools are completely underfunded. They
Mhm.
don't have they have overcrowded classrooms. They have like a revolving door of teachers. They have lack of special education programs, lack of like, programs that would help people who are struggling with reading or writing, with math. And it's like, and then when you add on top of it these resource officers who are basically like
Yeah.
cops who are policing the students. So, and it's like from a very early age. There was some statistics in the book, that 40% of students expelled from school are Black.
Mm.
And when you think about, like, I'm sure it kind of goes back to that study earlier when they were saying, "What do you imagine a drug user to look like?"
Mhm.
And when I say 40% of students who are expelled are Black, I'm sure you're imagining a Black teenager who's being disrespectful or starting a
Mhm.
fight, or, has sagging pants, whatever stereotypes come to
Mhm.
mind. But it was really interesting that, when we talk about preschool, that
Hmm.
Black children are 18% of all students nationally, but they account for 48% of preschoolers who receive more than one in out of school suspension.
Preschoolers are getting out of school suspension?
Preschoolers.
What on earth
Preschoolers.
for?
And I would just I wanna tell you a personal experience I had with this. Had started my oldest, well, my son who's 18 now, we had started him at a Catholic school when he was in kindergarten. And
Mm.
his first year went really well. And his second year, he had a teacher, and I believe it was her first year. Oh, sorry about that. I believe it was her first year teaching, and she had this system in the class where you'd get a green card if you were behaving well, get a yellow card if you needed some adjustments on your behavior, and got a red card if you had done something that she thought was like not acceptable in the classroom.
Ooh.
And if
Okay.
you got a red card, then you would have different levels of punishment for that.
Hmm.
So our son kept getting red card after red card after red card. And it ended up getting to the point where I asked the school, because he would have to go see the principal. And I asked the school if they would have an outside person come and sit in on the classroom and see exactly what's going on. Because we were working on it at home and saying, "Are you listening to the teacher? Are you not talking?" So they had a district psychologist who was
Mhm.
trained to observe classrooms come in the class, and she talked to my son, and she observed the class over a period of time, and she ended up writing a report that said that the teacher was picking out my son for
Mm.
behavior that other students in the classroom were doing, but she was picking him out and giving him the red card for the exact
Oh
same
no.
behavior. And so we ended up leaving that school because we didn't feel like the principal was really adequately responding to the problem. But that showed me from my personal experience how African American boys, especially, are oftentimes policed and
Yeah.
punished simply for being an African American boy.
Mm.
And it's
Man.
really heartbreaking when you think
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. And if you had to leave him in that environment for whatever reason, and you weren't able to do some other, and he carried that forward in his life without him doing anything wrong, the chances of him ending up incarcerated would have been significantly higher
Mhm.
than for his peer who looked like me.
And when you mention that, it is, youth who don't graduate from high school are 8 times more likely to go to prison.
Mm.
And Black youths are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than their a white peer,
Mm.
and Latino and Native Americans are 2 to 3 times more likely.
Mm.
So when you're talking about discrimination happening as early as preschool, and then when you talk about Black and brown kids being in these schools that are underfunded and
Yeah.
overpoliced,
Yeah.
and you because when you are in a school where you're not feeling like you're getting a proper education, and then you're constantly being policed
Mhm.
instead of treated like a youth in a school setting, then
Mhm.
that leads to higher amounts of people dropping out, and
Yeah.
then in turn leads to higher behavior that can lead to being incarcerated. So
Yeah.
it starts from the earliest ages.
Yeah, really. And I forget the statistic now, but just kind of the category that this study revealed, blew my mind. But he was talking about the number of virtual suspensions there have been during lockdown and the pandemic.
Hmm.
And I'm like, hang on, you're on Zoom. Like you can just mute the person. Like why? And it was a disproportionate number. And it was particularly in this study was looking at Black girls, a
Hmm.
disproportionate number of Black girls who have
Hmm.
been virtually suspended from
Hmm.
school.
Hmm.
Why do we need virtual suspensions? But it just
Really?
reveals this tacit need
Yeah.
to punish
Hmm.
punitively
Hmm.
people who don't need punishment.
Yeah.
They need partnership.
Yeah.
They need, oh man, yeah. And it as a white person who has moved in white circles my whole life, there does seem to be this element of, what you're talking about, the SROs in schools, the police and private prisons and all these other things we have set up. And we seem to have this desire of displacement. And what we say by that, like when you were talking about restoration and getting all parties involved, including the person who did wrong, my thought, a bit on purpose cynically, but also just really was like, oh, but then that asks something of me. But if I can just offload all of the penal requirements onto someone else, so I don't have to do anything, I can just walk away feeling like justice has been served. If I can do that, then that's easy. But as soon as you say, oh, I have to now be in conversation, I have to now explore what I did to contribute to that situation, what that person needs so the situation isn't repeated. Now that's work on my part.
Hmm.
Well, I would rather just pay a private prison and politicians and other policy structures to offload that responsibility from myself so I don't have to think about it. And
Yeah.
it's created um, this really derivative system
Hmm.
of excessive punishment. But I mean, I think about it from our food system, right? We say, gosh, I don't want to think about what I'm going to eat in 100 days and have to plant the right seeds and cultivate a crop. I'm going to outsource that thought to another country. And then I'm going to outsource the thought of, well, now how am I going to get that food? I'm going to outsource that thought to a food manufacturer who's going to make it shelf stable for me. So that way I can unburden myself from all thinking so I can just move through my life thoughtlessly.
Yeah.
We do it with our food, with our education, with our prison systems. We do it with our politicians. We do it with our pastors and our priests.
Hmm.
Say, I don't want to have to think about what God thinks of me. I'll just listen to what my pastor or priest says God thinks of me.
And I think it's interesting because when you're talking about the food and how it's like we don't want to think about it, look at what's happened to our climate because
Mm,
of that not wanting to think about it. And it's like I'd like to say the same thing. Look what's happening to the black and brown people who are
mhm.
suffering because of mass incarceration because we don't want to think about it. And I would say that everyone when we talk about slavery would say that if I was alive during that time, I would not be a slaveholder. I would be an abolitionist. I'd be against it. But it's like mass incarceration today is
Yeah,
called neo-slavery.
it is.
It's just another form, and like Michelle Alexander had coined the new Jim Crow.
Mhm.
This is a continuation of the same oppression and enslavement in a different form of Black people that's been going on since before the country was founded.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I, as a white man, continue to directly benefit from that system of subjugation. So not only has it preserved a system of slavery, but it's also preserved a system of white supremacy and white wealth.
Well, I think everyone who's not incarcerated continues to benefit from it because, like we said, when you have this huge amount of people, I think it's like 2.3 million people who are incarcerated right now. And when they're making products and providing services, that ends up being at a cheaper cost for us to buy
That's
those
true.
products or services.
Yeah.
So, in a way, we're all benefiting from it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, and part of what they're doing is also managing our food supply. And so
Mhm.
even the fact that we can buy food cheaply and at our whim is also partially a result of a system of mass incarceration.
Mhm.
In my journey, I was in full time. So, I was raised in a white evangelical church. Uh, Part of my own story is I went to high school in Kenya, and my parents were white missionaries in the country of Kenya. So that made me believe certain things about myself that I've had to now go back and unpack in my own story. I've been in this process of re-examining a lot of the things that I was told was true all growing up, which has led me to questioning a lot of my faith and the role Jesus plays in all of that versus the church and other things. And I've noticed, especially on your YouTube and other things, you seem to still very much identify as being part of the church. So, in light of everything we've been talking about, I guess I have two questions. The first part is, why Catholicism? And the second part is, why are you staying?
Well, I'm a what you call a cradle Catholic. My mom, um, like I said, was originally from South Africa, and she's been Catholic all her life. So
Mm,
I was born and raised Catholic and went to Catholic school, kindergarten, all the way up to my sophomore year in college, and then ended up transferring to a state school and graduating from a state school with a degree in religious studies. So I've always been Catholic. And honestly, the only time when I thought about not being Catholic was when I was studying Islam as part of
mm,
my religious studies major. And there was something about the reverence in Islam and, like, for example, like the prayer practices and how they like people who are really devout pray 5 times a day and just prostrating themselves. There was just something that was really, that touched me in a way. And also Malcolm X is a big influence,
mm,
a historical influence in my life. So that was the only time I really thought, like, would I possibly leave the Catholic Church?
mm,
Um, but now, as an adult, I've really been, and one of the things I explore on my YouTube channel is the role of Black Catholicism in the church. And
mhm,
it's like looking at Black saints that go all the way back to like the 15th century and looking at the African Americans on the path to sainthood and
mhm,
just looking at like the influence of African Americans in the church. All
mhm,
those type of things make me really feel like I can bring my cultural identity as an African American with me into the church. So I feel like that not I'm not ignorant to the racism that has plagued the church and continues to plague the church, but
mhm,
I just feel like I want to be a voice that is calling for equality and speaking up against that racism.
mm. And so if you were to say something, because I know that a lot of my listeners are in a zone that, for better or for worse, it's categorized as kind of a deconstructionist zone. People who are beginning to say there's something beyond just this material life that must be real. I don't know if what was given to me before really satiates that question of what that could be. So if there were other people listening to this who find themselves in a similar position to you as being a progressive Catholic, um, what would you say to them as far as, like, they're on the fence of like, man, should I just throw this whole thing out and start over? Should I keep trudging along with it? You've made the choice to keep staying in it. What would you say to people who are kind of on the fence in their own process of their place in the world?
Well, for me personally, um, the reason I'm still a Catholic is because I really get a lot out of the sacraments that the
Mm,
Catholic Church has, particularly the Eucharist. And I know that there's nowhere else I can go to participate in receiving the Eucharist.
mm,
So that's one of the reasons that it's a really big part of my life staying in the Catholic Church. But for people who, the sacraments, they don't participate in the sacraments, or they don't care about the Eucharist. It's just kind of more like, what can I get out of the church? For me, when I'm looking at it like that, it all comes down to my relationship with Jesus and
mm,
how I feel that because of the relationship I have, and because of my faith, it dictates everything that I do in the world.
Hmm.
And it really propels me. Like, I have a very close connection with the Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
And I feel like I'm led by what the Holy Spirit kind of directs me to do. So I feel like, in order to, like, sometimes religion can just feel like you're thinking about ideas, and it's like, do I like this idea? Do I believe this idea?
Hmm.
But where I am right now in my faith is more a relationship
Hmm.
than an idea or a thought. It's like a relationship with Jesus, a relationship with the Blessed Mother, with the saints, with the Holy Spirit. That's what keeps me in the church also.
And I guess what I'm hearing is it's a relationship that has practical implications for your Monday morning decision making,
Mhm.
as opposed
Absolutely.
to just kind of this theoretical like afterlife or something else.
Yeah, definitely.
That's
And
very rooted. Yeah.
I think with a lot of Catholics, because I think that the Catholic people who are raised Catholic have the highest rates of leaving the church. And
Mm,
I think that one of the reasons is because if you just go to church, if you show up and go through the motions and go home once a week, that's not a relationship.
right.
And I think
Mhm.
that we really have to get back to a relationship with Jesus
Mhm.
to feel that you want to participate in Christianity.
I 100% agree. Absolutely. And that's kind of where I am in my own journey is and I think maybe I'm being a little too severe to the institution, but I'm kind of like, okay, the relationship matters so much that I need to kind of sort through all the dross a little bit and just kind of focus in on that, which means that have thrown out some of the baby with the bathwater a little bit. But you're so for you, because it sounds like maybe we arrived at the same point from different places and are doing different things with that realization. But this moment of like, if we're going to keep doing this thing, it's got to be about relationship, not
Mhm,
about like performance or something
mhm,
else. And that
mhm.
relationship, at least for me, has to have practical implications for my daily life. It can't
Yes.
have these ethereal implications, although those are important too, but it has to be practical. So, did that realization come to you through a series of teachings? Was that like your own moment where you kind of felt yourself on the brink and you're like, if I'm going to keep moving forward with this Catholic journey, like I need to base it on something different than just going to church? How did you kind of get to that place where you can now ground yourself in that tenet of relationship? Because I know it can be talked about a lot sometimes, but I'm not sure that everyone who shows up at church is really tracking with what we're saying.
Well, I think I've had a few different, what I guess I would say, like, when Saint Paul gets knocked off the horse. Actually, was he the one who got knocked off the horse? I always get that confused. But when he feels like he has a personal encounter with Jesus and then he's blinded for
Yes.
3 days,
Yes.
um, I've had that happen in life where it's kind of like I have either something traumatic or just a really big trial. And I understand in that moment that the only way I made it to the other side was through God intervening in my life.
Mm,
And when I've had that happen, it kind of realigns me with God and with my faith. Because
hmm,
I think that so many times when we don't need God, we almost forget about him.
hmm.
Because
Yeah.
it's like when you're in a position where you need him and you're praying to him and he answers that, then it's like there's that relationship right there. And
Yeah.
I've learned from my experience that I don't want to be that type of friend who's only there when I need to ask you for something.
Hmm.
I want to have a relationship with you that I ask you, what do you need me to do? Instead
Hmm.
of me just coming with a laundry list of demands for God.
Yeah. 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 That changes things a lot. Yeah. Wow. Well, Alessandra, I have loved this conversation and I am so thankful that you've been stretching it out a little bit longer. I've learned a lot from you. I've really appreciated your wisdom and your voice in this. And I know that everyone listening has definitely walked away with a lot of good stuff as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.